Humans withdraw from peace talks. The Galactic Council recognizes their mistake. I had attended 43 sessions of the Grand Conclave in my career as a diplomat, and I had never once seen a delegation walk out in silence, shouting. I had seen accusations thrown across the floor like stones. Once a Barathi elder had overturned his translation terminal and stormed out cursing in 4 languages. That was memorable. That made sense to me. Anger has a logic I can follow. But what happened in that chamber on the 19th day of the Vithara Accord negotiations was something I had no frame for. It took me weeks to understand it. By then, the damage was already spreading through the galaxy like a crack running through old ice. My name is Kale Vor. I represent the Dranathi hegemony, a mid-tier signatory with interests in 3 frontier systems and a long history of staying carefully neutral. I was seated in the 3rd row, behind the Tashrivan block when it happened. I had my stylus in hand. I was writing notes about a proposed amendment to Article 9 when I noticed the silence. Not the usual silence between speakers, something thicker. I looked up. Ambassador Claire Sutton of the United Earth Directorate was standing. She was not shouting. She was not gesturing. She was not making any of the grand dramatic moves that alien delegates sometimes made when they wanted the room's attention. She was simply standing, straight-backed and still, her datapad held at her side, her eyes moving slowly across the chamber in a single, complete sweep. She looked at every delegate, or at least that was how it felt. Her gaze passed over the Talshrivan block without lingering. It passed over Councillor Drevanath at the central podium without expression. It passed over me, and I felt something in it that I cannot name precisely. Not contempt, not anger. Something more like a final measurement. Then she said 2 words. We're done. She set her datapad on the table. She did not slam it. She placed it neatly, face down, as though she was setting it down for someone else to find. Then she pushed her chair back and walked toward the exit. Behind her, without a word, without a signal that I could see, every single member of the human delegation stood, all 40 of them. Aides, analysts, junior diplomats, the medical liaison, the cultural attaché, the 2 young interpreters who had been sitting against the far wall. All of them rose and moved toward the door in a quiet, orderly stream. No one spoke, no one looked back. The chamber doors slid shut behind them. For a full 4 seconds, no one in that room made a sound. Then the laughter started. It came first from the Talshrivan side, a dry, clicking sound that their species makes when they find something absurd. Then a few of the Varanti delegates exchanged looks and began murmuring with smiles on their faces. Someone near the back made a comment I could not hear clearly, but the people around them chuckled. Councillor Drevanath allowed himself a thin smile and tapped his ceremonial ring against the podium. We will take a short recess, he announced, in a tone that suggested the morning had produced no event worth discussing. I did not laugh. I sat very still with my stylus above my notepad, and I tried to understand what I had just watched. I need to give you the context, because without it, the walkout looks like wounded pride. It was not wounded pride. I understand that now, but I did not understand it then, and I want to be honest about that. Because my failure to understand it is exactly the kind of failure this account is meant to document. The Vithara Accord negotiations had been running for 7 months. The goal was a new interstellar security compact, a framework to govern joint military response, resource sharing, and border arbitration across 34 species. It was necessary. 2 frontier wars had broken out in the previous decade, and 3 more were growing more likely every year. Everyone at the table wanted the accord. That was not the problem. The problem was that some species at that table had decided, long before the first session, that certain voices mattered more than others. The human delegation had arrived with detailed proposals. I had read them. They were good proposals, clear, practical, and grounded in data. Humans had been operating peacekeeping forces in 6 contested zones for the previous 12 years, and their experience showed. They knew which resource sharing arrangements actually held under pressure, and which ones collapsed. They knew which border arbitration models led to long-term stability. Their proposals were not brilliant in the way that ancient civilizations sometimes produce brilliant ideas. They were better than that. They were practical. They had been tested. The Tashrivan dismissed them without debate on the 2nd day, citing procedural insufficiency, a rule that required proposals to be co-sponsored by 2 senior bloc members before they could be formally discussed. The humans had not known this rule existed. It was not written in any of the pre-session materials. When Ambassador Sutton raised this, the Council's administrative officer confirmed that the rule was indeed part of the Conclave's internal governance code and had been for some time. She accepted it without argument and spent the next 6 days finding co-sponsors among smaller delegations. The Talshrivan then introduced a new amendment that quietly raised the minimum co-sponsorship requirement from 2 senior members to 4. I watched Sutton receive this news. She was sitting across the aisle from me. Her face did not change. For the following 2 months, the pattern repeated itself in various forms. Human proposals were delayed, rerouted, or absorbed into larger block motions and then stripped of their key provisions before being brought to a vote. Human delegates were consistently talked over during open floor sessions. When one of Sutton's aides, a young man named Oliver Grant, raised his hand to speak during the Article 7 discussions, the floor monitor acknowledged 3 other delegations before finally calling on him, and by the time he spoke, his point had already been made by a towel-shriven speaker and attributed to them in the official record. I noticed these things. I wrote notes about them. I did not say anything, because I am a diplomat from a mid-tier hegemony, and I had not come to Vethara Station to make enemies in the senior blocks. I am not proud of that now. On the 17th day of negotiations, the Council reached Article 12, the Security Veto Clause. This was the heart of the accord, the provision that gave each of the 5 designated senior-tier species a single hard veto over any military engagement involving their forces. The humans had been classified as a senior-tier species 3 years earlier, after their combined peacekeeping operations crossed the thaw threshold that triggered the designation. Their veto right was written clearly into the draft. On the evening of Day 17, during a 4-hour recess that was supposed to be used for informal consultations, Councillor Drevenath held a closed session with the 4 other senior-tier delegations. I know this because one of the Barathi junior diplomats told me about it afterward, somewhat shaken. The Drenathi were not invited. The humans were not invited. When negotiations resumed on the morning of Day 18, the text of Article 12 had been revised. The revision was small. 11 words had been changed. The effect was significant. The new language defined a senior-tier veto as applicable only to species with founding membership status in the Galactic Council, a designation that the human species which had joined the Council only 30 years ago did not hold. With 11 words, the human veto had been erased. The change was embedded in a 40-page revision document that was distributed to all delegations during a busy floor session covering Articles 14 through 19. It was, I think, intended to go unnoticed until after the accord was signed. On Day 19, I watched Sutton read through her materials during the morning session. She read steadily. She did not react. She continued reading through the lunch recess while her staff ate around her. When the afternoon session began, she sat quietly through 2 hours of discussion on Article 16. I noticed she had not made any notes. Her stylus sat unused beside her datapad. At precisely the 3rd hour of the afternoon session, during a brief pause between speakers, she stood up. You already know what happened next. What I keep returning to in all the days that followed is this. She said 2 words and placed her datapad on the table and walked out, and behind her 40 people stood up without being asked. No signal, no warning look, no gesture. They had prepared for this. They had known this was coming. For how long? A day? A week? The entire 7 months? I sat in that chamber after the doors closed and I tried to count how many times I had underestimated those quiet, short-lived, impatient, apparently unsophisticated newcomers in the years since they had joined the Council. I lost count before I reached double digits. The session resumed. Drevenath guided us through the afternoon agenda with smooth efficiency. The mood was almost festive in some corners. Without the humans, certain procedural bottlenecks simply disappeared. The Talshriven moved faster. Votes that had been stalled for weeks were suddenly uncomplicated. I voted on 3 items that afternoon. I cannot tell you now what they were about. I was thinking about those 40 people walking through a doorway in silence, and the very specific, very controlled expression on Claire Sutton's face as she had swept her gaze across the room. She had not looked angry. She had not looked hurt. She had looked like a woman who had just confirmed something she already knew and had already planned for. That evening, I sent a short message to my own government. I told them the human delegation had withdrawn. I told them the official mood in the chamber was that the negotiation would proceed more smoothly without them. I also wrote, at the bottom of the message, one personal note. I wrote, I am not certain this is the correct conclusion. I suggest we begin reviewing which of our current frontier security arrangements involve human operational support. I did not receive a reply for 3 days. I understand now why no one was worried. I understand why the laughter felt natural to so many of my colleagues. The humans were new. They were small, by galactic standards. They lived for barely a century each, most of them. They were known for emotion, for impulsiveness, for caring too much about things that older civilizations had long since learned to approach with detachment. They had stormed into galactic politics only 3 decades ago with a kind of intense, exhausting energy that most of the senior species found mildly amusing and occasionally useful. What we had never done, what I am not sure any of us had ever done, was sit down and make an honest list of what they had built while we were busy, being amused by them. That list would have changed the tone in that chamber considerably. But we did not know about the list yet. We would learn about it soon, and not in a way any of us had chosen. The doors of the conclave hall were sealed for the evening. The stars outside Vithara station turned slowly in the dark. Somewhere in another part of the station, I imagined, 40 humans were packing their bags and filing their departure notices, and doing it all with the same quiet efficiency they had brought to everything else. I poured myself a drink and stared at my notes and tried very hard to shake the feeling that we had just made a terrible mistake. I could not shake it. I want to be clear about something before I describe what I found, because the numbers I am about to give you are accurate and I have verified them 3 times, and I know how they sound. I know they sound like the kind of findings that get quietly adjusted before they reach senior leadership, smoothed down at the edges so no one has to feel uncomfortable. I did not adjust these findings. I am an analyst, and the number is the number, and this is my private log, and so I am going to tell you exactly what I found. My name is Sivra. I am a fleet analyst in the Tal Shriven Intelligence Bureau, 3rd Division, Frontier Systems Desk. I have held this position for 11 years. I am not given to overreaction. My supervisors have noted this in my evaluations. Sivra is methodical, they write. Sivra does not catastrophize. I have taken pride in this. I am writing this log because 3 weeks after the human delegation walked out of the Vithara Accord negotiations, my supervisors gave me what they described as a routine assignment, a standard impact assessment of the human withdrawal. Protocol required it. It was expected to confirm what everyone already believed, that the departure was a minor inconvenience, that adjustments could be made, and that negotiations were proceeding better, without the constant procedural friction the humans had introduced. I was given 4 days to complete the assessment. I asked for 12. My supervisor raised an eyebrow. I told him the data was more complex than expected. He told me I had 6 days and to stop being dramatic. I am not being dramatic. I need to say that plainly for the record, because by the time I was done, my findings looked so severe that I knew they would be read as exaggeration by people who had not sat with the raw data for days on end as I had. Let me start with the frontier zones, because that is where I started, and that is where the first signal hit me with enough force that I had to stand up and walk away from my terminal for a few minutes before I could continue. There are 6 contested frontier zones that the Galactic Council currently considers stabilized. Stabilized means there is no active armed conflict, there is functioning trade flow, there is some form of local governance operating, and the Council has a presence in the zone that allows early warning of escalation. 6 zones. The Council has been treating their stabilization as a collective achievement, a sign of the Accord framework working. What the Council's official reporting does not highlight, because no one was ever asked to separate the contributions out, is what was actually holding those zones together. In all 6 of them, human rapid response units were the primary on-ground force, not the largest force on paper. On paper, the Joint Council peacekeeping formation looked balanced, with contributions from 8 or 9 species, but on paper and in practice turned out to be very different things. The Tal Shriven contribution to Zone 4, for example, consisted of 4 orbital observers and a communications relay. The Dranathi contribution to Zone 2 was a diplomatic mission of 6 people who, as far as I could determine, had not left their compound in 14 months. The human contribution to Zone 2 was a rapid deployment unit of 300 personnel with 4 FTL-capable supply vessels and a standing medical response team. When the humans filed their withdrawal paperwork, quietly, with no announcement, no press statement, just standard military administrative forms submitted through the proper council channels, those 300 people left. The 4 supply vessels left. The medical team left. The orbital observers and the 6 diplomats who had not left their compound in 14 months remained. I modeled what happens next. In Zone 2, there is a population of roughly 4 million people across 9 inhabited stations, most of them Barathi and Marak. They live in a region where 2 rival factions have been in a state of armed tension for 60 years. For the past 12 years, that tension has been managed. The Human Rapid Response Unit ran patrols, operated a listening network, mediated 2 separate near flashpoints in the past 18 months, and maintained the supply chain that kept the Zone 2 civilian infrastructure, power, water processing, food distribution, running at the level required to prevent the kind of scarcity that typically accelerates armed conflict. Without them, the model gave me 11 months before active conflict resumed. Not 11 months of peace followed by war. 11 months of deteriorating conditions, increasing scarcity, rising tension, and then war. The model gave a 73% probability of armed conflict within that window and a 91% probability within 24 months. I ran the model again with different parameters. I made optimistic assumptions. I assumed the Dranathi diplomats would leave their compound. I assumed the tall-shriven orbital observers would somehow acquire ground capability they did not possess. The model gave me 14 months to conflict at best. The probability remained above 60% in every scenario that did not include reintroducing human logistics infrastructure. I sat with that for a while. Then I looked at Zone 4 and then Zone 5 and then the others, and I found variations on the same pattern in every single one. The degree varied. Zone 6 was slightly less dependent on human presence, though still significantly so, but the direction was the same. Everywhere I looked, the Council's peacekeeping presence turned out to have a load-bearing structure that was not labeled as such on any official document, and that load-bearing structure had just quietly removed itself. I moved on to the supply chain data, because I thought perhaps the security picture was the worst of it, and the economic data would be more moderate. It was not more moderate. Human commercial shipping had been rerouted. This was also done quietly. No embargo declaration, no formal notice to Council trade authorities. Human shipping companies simply updated their route filings, as any private commercial entity is entitled to do. The rerouting happened over the course of 10 days, incrementally, and by the time any of the Council's trade monitoring systems flagged it as a pattern, 70% of human commercial traffic through the Vethara corridor had already shifted to alternative routes outside Council-adjacent space. The Vethara corridor, I should explain, is not simply one shipping lane among many. It is the primary transit route connecting the inner systems to 4 of the 6 frontier zones. Goods moving along the corridor have reduced transit times by 30 to 40% compared to any available alternative route. For perishable medical supplies, for food, for components that deteriorate in transit, this matters enormously. Human shipping had not been the majority carrier in the corridor. It had been approximately 38% of total traffic volume. That sounds manageable until you understand which 38% it was. Human carriers had specialized in the high-priority, time-sensitive cargo, the medical supplies, the precision equipment, the emergency food shipments, because their FTL logistics systems were the most efficient available for that kind of cargo. The remaining 62% of the corridor's traffic was mostly bulk freight on longer schedules, which could absorb delays. Without the human carriers, the high-priority cargo had nowhere to go except onto bulk carriers that were not optimized for it and could not match the transit times. The insurance markets noticed before the Council did. I pulled the actuarial data for corridor-adjacent freight within 2 weeks of the human rerouting, and the risk premiums had already moved. 3 separate insurance syndicates in the Barathi system had quietly raised their rates for medical cargo transiting through Zone 2 and Zone 4. They had done the same math I was doing, and they had done it faster. I kept going. I pulled every operational dataset I could access, and at every level, military, commercial, medical, agricultural, the same structural picture emerged. Humans had been doing things. Not flashy things. Not things that got entered into the official conclave record with formal speeches and attribution. Quiet things. Functional things. Things that other species had been content to leave to them because they did them efficiently and without complaint, and the results were good. 31%. That was the number I kept coming back to. Across all categories: security, logistics, medical response, emergency infrastructure. Humans had been providing what my model calculated as 31% of the functional load holding the current Accord framework together. Not 31% of the credit, not 31% of the official recognition, 31% of the actual work. And they had been doing it as a junior member species, as a newcomer, as the species whose proposals got buried in procedure and whose delegates got talked over on the floor. I also found, during this period, something that I want to include because I think it matters. Evidence of what I can only call deliberate invisibility. I found internal human diplomatic communications, through a source I am not going to name in this log, that indicated the human delegation had been aware of the extent of their operational contribution and had explicitly chosen not to emphasize it. There was a message from Oliver Grant, a junior aide, to his superior, asking whether they should present a formal accounting of human contributions to the Accord Council. The reply, from someone senior, I believe it was one of Sutton's deputies, a man named Henry Park, said simply, "Not yet. If we have to tell them, it means something." I read that line 3 times. I filed my report on the 6th day as my supervisor had required. I did not soften the numbers. I submitted the full dataset, the full model, all 6 frontier zone projections, the shipping data, the insurance actuarial movements, and the 31% figure with its methodology attached. My report was 47 pages long. My summary was 2 pages. The summary said, in plain language, that the human withdrawal had exposed a structural dependency that the Council had not previously acknowledged, and that the consequences of continued absence would be severe and would manifest within weeks in the frontier zones. My supervisor read the summary that afternoon. He told me I had done thorough work. He also told me I had probably overweighted the human contribution due to recency bias following a high-profile political event, and that the system was more resilient than I was giving it credit for. He marked the report as informational, low-priority action required, and filed it into the internal archive. I asked him what low-priority action required meant. He said it meant they would monitor the situation. I went back to my desk. I want to describe the feeling I had, sitting at my desk in the bureau after that conversation, because I think it is important. It was not anger, exactly. It was something more like the particular helplessness of being the only person in a room who can see a crack in the wall and being told by everyone else that the wall looks fine. I had spent 6 days mapping a disaster in careful detail, and the careful detail had been met with a shrug. That evening I started this private log. Over the following week I continued monitoring. I did not wait to be asked. I pulled the updates from Zone 2 every morning. The Drenathy diplomatic mission, true to my model's pessimistic assumption, did not leave their compound. The Talshriven orbital observers filed their standard reports from their comfortable position in high orbit, noting increasing surface movement among the rival factions, categorizing it as elevated but within normal variance. I noted that normal variance had been recalibrated upward 4 times in 3 years, always following a period of human-mediated de-escalation that had prevented the previous high watermark from being reached. In other words, what the observers were calling normal was normal only because the humans had kept renegotiating the ceiling. Without them, there was no mechanism for that. The ceiling was just going to rise until it broke. On the 9th day after I filed my report, a plague ship arrived in the Barathi home system. This was not related to the frontier zones. It was a separate event, a vessel carrying a viral outbreak that had originated in a distant colony. Under normal circumstances, this was exactly the kind of event that the Joint Council Medical Response Framework was designed to handle. The framework called for immediate quarantine, medical assessment, and rapid deployment of treatment resources. The rapid deployment part required fast transit. The human medical logistics network was gone. The plague ship was quarantined. The treatment resources were assembled. They sat in a Barathi depot waiting for a carrier that could make the transit in time for the treatment to be effective. The bulk carriers available could make the trip in 19 days. The treatment protocol required delivery within 11. An entire system went into extended quarantine because no one who remained could move fast enough. I updated my report. I sent the update to my supervisor with a note that said I believed the situation had moved from monitor to urgent. He replied that upper leadership was aware and that I should continue my regular assignments while the matter was being reviewed at higher levels. I have been watching Zone 2 every morning for 3 weeks now. The surface movement has increased by 60% over baseline. 3 separate trade convoys have been delayed. 1 local governance council has suspended operations citing security concerns. No one has announced any plan to address this. I have begun to wonder if our leadership genuinely does not understand what is happening, or if they understand and cannot figure out how to respond without admitting that they were wrong to remove the humans from the table. And that the second problem is too large to get past. I think about Oliver Grant's message. If we have to tell them, it means something. They did not have to tell us. They just left, and the weight fell, and now the floor is cracking. And somewhere out there, those 40 people are sitting in whatever passes for a comfortable room on their home station, and they are watching the same data I am watching, and they already knew this was coming, and they prepared for it, and they are waiting. I keep thinking about that. I keep thinking about what it means that they prepared. My supervisor told me I was overweighting their contribution due to recency bias. I have looked at the data every day for 3 weeks, and I have tried to find where he might be right. I have tried to find the error in my methodology. I have run the model with reduced parameters, with alternative assumptions. With every correction I can think of, the number keeps coming back the same. 31%. They were carrying 31% of the weight of the piece, and none of us ever thanked them for it, and now it is gone. And I am sitting in a bureau office writing notes that nobody reads, watching a crack spread through the architecture of everything we built. And I am realizing very slowly that the difference between a species that is new to this and a species that is old at it is not wisdom. Sometimes the difference is just that one of them has been here long enough to stop noticing what they take for granted. The humans noticed. They always noticed. They just chose not to say. The session had been called for the 3rd hour of the morning cycle, which meant every delegate on Vithara Station had been woken before their biological rest was complete. I noticed this as I took my seat in the emergency chamber, the smaller, sealed room used for closed council proceedings, because I have been a diplomat long enough to know that exhausted people make worse decisions. And whoever had called this session at this hour had either not thought about that or had wanted the effect. My name is K.L. Vor, and I had been awake for most of the night before this session, because a Barathi colleague had knocked on my door at the second hour and handed me a data packet without a word. I had read it for 2 hours and then sat in the dark for another hour before getting dressed. The packet contained a 47-page intelligence report from the Talshrevan Bureau's Frontier Systems Desk. It had been filed and marked low priority 6 weeks ago. It had been leaked to at least a dozen delegations in the past 18 hours. I do not know who leaked it. I suspect it was someone in the Bureau itself, someone who had watched the situation deteriorate and could no longer remain silent. Whoever it was, they had done the rest of us a significant service, even if they had done their career no favors. The chamber filled quickly. 41 delegates representing 31 species. The 4 senior-tier delegations occupied the raised section at the front. Councillor Drevanath sat at the central podium with the practiced stillness of a being who has controlled difficult rooms for the better part of 2 centuries. He did not look like a being who had read the report, or perhaps he looked exactly like a being who had read it and had decided how he was going to respond to it and was confident in that decision. It is sometimes hard to tell the difference with Drevanath. He opened the session by acknowledging that a circulating document had prompted this gathering, and that the council would now hear a formal presentation of its contents. He gestured to an aide, who pulled the report onto the main display. Then, because he was Drevanath and he understood the performance of authority better than almost anyone I had ever met, he leaned back slightly in his chair and adopted an expression that suggested this was all very manageable and he was simply being thorough. The aide began reading. I watched the room as the numbers went up on the display. The Frontier Zone projections hit first. 11 months to conflict in Zone 2. The Barathi delegation, 3 seats to my right, went very still. Their lead diplomat, a woman named Kala Ren, put down her stylus. She did not pick it up again for the rest of the session. Zone 4 followed, then Zone 5. The numbers were not abstract. Each zone had names attached, station names, population figures, species affected. Kala Ren's homeworld had a colony on one of those stations. I knew that because she mentioned it during the Article 7 discussions 6 weeks ago, in a context that was now excruciatingly relevant. Then the supply chain data, the shipping rerouting, the insurance market movements, the medical logistics gap that had left a plague ship system in extended quarantine. The room absorbed this with a particular quiet that falls over a space when the people in it are rapidly recalculating something they thought they understood. Then the 31% figure. Drevanath allowed the aide to read it. He did not intervene, which told me he had made a judgment that interrupting would look worse than letting it sit. He was right about that. But the judgment itself revealed that he was managing perception rather than responding to content, and the room was not in a mood to be managed. 31%, the aide said, reading directly from the summary. Across all operational categories, security, logistics, medical response, and emergency infrastructure, human contributions represented 31% of the functional load, supporting the current Accord framework. This contribution was not reflected in official records, formal credit attributions, or the treaty text as currently drafted. There was a pause. Kala Ren very quietly said, 11 months. It was not directed at anyone. It was the kinds of statement a person makes to themselves when a number finally lands in a way that makes it real. But the room was very quiet and everyone heard it. Drevanath spoke then, smoothly and without hesitation, because this was what he was good at. He acknowledged the report's findings. He described them as a useful accounting of operational dependencies that the Council would now be better positioned to address through structured burden-sharing realignment. He said the human withdrawal, while unexpected, had provided an opportunity to review and strengthen the framework. He used the word opportunity twice in 4 sentences. The Barathi delegation's second-in-command, a sharp-eyed man named Oliver Marsh who had said almost nothing in 6 weeks of negotiations, raised his hand and was acknowledged. Counselor, he said, in a tone that was controlled and precise, 3 of our colony stations are in Zone 2. 2 of them are below emergency supply threshold as of this week. The other has suspended its water processing due to a parts shortage that was supposed to be addressed by a human logistics delivery that no longer exists. We have been monitoring this for 2 weeks and have been assured it was being reviewed at higher levels. I would like to know what structured burden sharing realignment looks like on a practical timeline relative to the next 11 months. Because my government needs a specific answer, not a framework description. Drevanath said that he understood the urgency and that the Council's Logistics Committee would convene within the week. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote something on his notepad, slowly, and said nothing further. The session continued. It continued for 8 hours, which was almost unprecedented for a closed council session. I watched Drevanath navigate it with genuine skill. He was not an incompetent man, and I want to be honest about that. He was a man who had made a calculation based on assumptions that turned out to be wrong, and he was now trying to manage the consequences of that without conceding the original calculation, because conceding it would require conceding a great deal more. About 3 hours in, a message was read to the chamber. It had been sent from Ambassador Claire Sutton's office in response to a council communication sent 2 days earlier, requesting that the human delegation reconsider their departure in light of the ongoing negotiations. The response was 3 sentences. The United Earth Directorate remains committed to interstellar cooperation and to the goals of the Vithara Accord. We are prepared to return to negotiations when the original treaty text is restored in full, including the provisions of Article 12 as written prior to the Day 17 revision. We look forward to continuing this conversation as equals. The aide finished reading. There was a silence of several seconds. Then a tall-shriven delegate, not a senior figure, one of the junior analysts who sat in the observation row, made a quiet comment to the person next to them. I could not hear it from where I sat, but I could read lips well enough to see that the word he used, in Talshriven, was the one that translates roughly as immovable. He was not wrong. The phrase as equals sat in the air of that room for a long time. It was only 2 words, but they were doing significant work, because everyone in that chamber understood what they meant. That the previous 7 months of negotiations had not been conducted that way, and that Sutton was naming that fact out loud and on the record, not with anger, not with accusation, with the precise, unapologetic clarity of a statement that does not require the other party's agreement to be true. Drevanath convened the senior block for a private consultation during the midday recess. I was, again, not invited. I sat in the outer corridor with a cup of something warm and thought about what I knew. I knew that at least 3 senior-tier delegations had reached out privately to human diplomatic liaisons in the past week. I knew because my own government had been contacted by one of those delegations asking whether the Drenathi had any channel to the humans. I did not know the content of those private conversations. I suspected they were exploratory, cautious, full of the kind of language that experienced diplomats use when they want to communicate urgency while preserving the appearance of calm. I also suspected the humans were logging them. When the session resumed, Drevanath presented a proposal. It was carefully worded. It described a review process for Article 12 that would ensure all senior-tier designations are appropriately reflected. It did not use the word "distort." It did not use the word "apology." It did not mention the Day 17 revision specifically. It created a committee. Caloran asked in a tone of mild but absolute clarity whether the proposed review process would result in the reinstatement of the original Article 12 language, specifically including the human veto provision, before any new signatures were sought. Drevanath said that outcomes would depend on the committee's findings. Wren looked at him for a moment. "Then I am not able to support this proposal," she said. This was the moment that changed the shape of the session, because Caloran was not a fringe voice. The Barathi were a mid-senior species with significant frontier zone exposure and a reputation for measured, reliable positions. When she declined to support the proposal, 2 other delegations that had been sitting quietly also declined. A 4th asked for more time to consult their government. Drevanath held the room together barely through the afternoon. By the time the session was formally closed, 9 hours after it had opened, no decision had been reached. The committee proposal remained on the table, unsupported. 3 frontier zone situations had been formally escalated to active monitoring. The plague ship quarantine had been mentioned twice more, and both times the subject of human medical logistics had followed like an unwelcome shadow. As delegates filed out, I watched Drevanath remain at the podium, speaking in low tones with his senior aide. I am not in the habit of imagining what other beings are feeling, because I have learned that I am usually wrong. But I had known Drevanath for 20 years, and in those 20 years I had never seen him look the way he looked in that moment. Not defeated, exactly, but recalculating, rapidly and quietly recalculating. I went back to my quarters. I pulled up my notes from Day 19, the day of the walkout. I read them again. Then I wrote one more entry. The session today lasted 8 hours and ended without resolution. Drevanath created a committee. Wren rejected it. 3 zones escalated. The humans sent 3 sentences and they were enough. I think we spent today discovering that the most difficult thing about this situation is not the logistics problems, and not the frontier zone deterioration, and not even the plague ship. The most difficult thing is that the humans are right, and we all know they are right, and the path back to stability requires someone to say so on the record. I closed my notes. Through the observation window, Vithara Station turned against the dark, and the stars were steady and indifferent, and somewhere between here and Earth, 31% of the weight was still sitting unclaimed on the floor of a galaxy that had convinced itself it could manage without it. My grandfather kept a framed piece of paper on the wall of his kitchen in Bristol. It was old, water-stained at one corner, and the print was faded enough that you had to stand close to read it. It was a quote from a labor organizer who had lived and died long before space travel was anything more than science fiction. The quote said, "You do not negotiate with a man who has not yet understood what he needs from you. You wait. And while you wait, you make sure you are indispensable." I thought about that quote a lot during the 8 weeks we were away from Vithara Station. My name is Claire Sutton. I am the Ambassador at Large for the United Earth Directorate, and I have been a diplomat for 22 years. And I want to tell you what actually happened, because the version that will eventually be written into the official records will be accurate in its facts and incomplete in its understanding. And I think the understanding matters. When I stood up in that chamber on day 19 and said, "We're done," it was not an impulse. It was the conclusion of a plan that had been in motion for 4 months. And the plan had not been mine alone. It had been built by a team of people who deserve to be named and who will not be named widely enough. So I am going to name them here. Henry Park, my deputy, who had spent 3 months mapping every operational contribution the human presence made, the Accord framework, and who had done it without being asked, because he saw the same thing I saw and started preparing without being told. Laura Simmons, our logistics analyst, who built the withdrawal timeline so that every human operational unit could be extracted cleanly and on schedule without disrupting any active life-saving operation in progress at the moment we left, because we were not going to let anyone die just to make a point. Oliver Grant, our youngest aide, who had been talked over on the floor of the conclave 11 times in 7 months and had never once shown it on his face, and who had quietly documented every single instance in a running log that formed part of the evidentiary record we kept, and a dozen others. Engineers, medical liaisons, military coordinators, cultural attaché, people who had spent months doing their work with full knowledge that it might end with a deliberate, planned withdrawal, and who had kept doing it at the same level of quality throughout, because that is what professionals do. We had called it, internally, Option 12. It was named for the article that started everything, though in truth the Day 17 revision had not been the beginning. It had been the confirmation. The pattern had been visible from the first weeks of the session. The procedural barriers, the sponsorship rules that materialized and then shifted, the floor scheduling that consistently placed our speakers last or passed over them entirely. These were not accidents. They were a structure, and the structure was designed to ensure that even if humanity was physically present at the table, it would have no meaningful voice in the outcome. I want to be honest about what I felt during those 7 months, because I think people sometimes expect that what I felt was anger, and anger is the wrong word. Anger is a response to something unexpected, and I had not been surprised. I had been watching this dynamic build for the 3 years since humanity's senior tier designation had come through, watching the way certain established species reacted to the idea that a young civilization, young by their standards, which meant an eye blink, had been given the same formal standing they held. I had seen it before in smaller contexts, in regional council chambers, in bilateral negotiations. The resistance to newcomers is not unique to any one species or any one civilization. It is almost universal. The form it takes varies. The instinct behind it is the same. What I felt was not anger. What I felt was the quiet, patient certainty of someone who has seen this particular play run before and knows how it ends if you let it run on its terms. And I had decided, with my team, that we were not going to let it run on its terms. Option 12 had 4 conditions for activation. First, that a good faith effort to participate had been made and demonstrably exhausted. We had spent 7 months in that chamber making proposals, seeking co-sponsors, following every procedure, adapting to every new rule they introduced. The record was thorough. Second, that our operational contributions had been fully documented in a format that could be verified independently, so that our withdrawal would speak for itself and not require us to make arguments. Henry and Laura had finished that documentation 6 weeks before we left. Third, that no active crisis was underway, that our withdrawal would worsen in a way that could not be managed, a condition we took seriously enough to delay the plan by 3 weeks when a supply emergency in Zone 4 required our logistics team to stay through a critical window. We were not going to leave people in danger to make a point. Fourth, that the trigger event was unambiguous, a moment that was clearly documented, clearly deliberate on their part, and clearly a line. The Day 17 revision was the 4th condition. When I found the change in Article 12 during the morning session on Day 19, I read it 3 times. Then I read the surrounding language. Then I looked at the timestamp on the revision document against the session schedule to confirm when the change had been made. It had been made during the recess, the 4 hours when the senior block had held a meeting to which we had not been invited. I looked across the chamber at Drevanath. He was speaking to a colleague with the easy assurance of a man who has resolved a problem neatly. He had not told us. He had not even tried to brief us on the change. He had simply embedded it in a 40-page document and distributed it during a busy session and expected that either we would not notice, or that by the time we did, the momentum toward final signing would make it too late to object effectively. I sat through the afternoon session. I did not speak. I did not react. I needed to confirm one thing, which was that none of my team was going to react before I did. That they would read their copies of the revision document and hold still until I moved. I had prepared them for this. They held. At the end of the 3rd hour, I stood up. I want to say something about those 2 words, because people have asked me since whether I considered saying more. I did not. I had thought about this moment for months, and I had concluded that the most powerful statement we could make was the smallest one. Not because we had nothing to say. We had everything to say, and all of it was documented and all of it was ready. But because the strength of what we were doing was not in the argument. The argument would come later, on our terms in writing, with every number attached. In that moment, the only thing that needed to be communicated was a decision. Decisions do not require speeches. We're done. I placed my datapad on the table. I had thought about that too. Placing it rather than taking it, leaving something behind rather than sweeping it away dramatically. A small signal to anyone watching carefully that we were not leaving in disarray. We were leaving in order. Behind me, my team stood. I had not given a signal. I did not need to. We had talked about this moment. We had agreed on what it would feel like and what we would do. They knew. We walked out. I did not look back. I could hear the murmuring starting behind us, and then, as the doors closed, the first sounds of laughter. I had expected the laughter. I had told Henry it would happen. He had asked how I felt about it. I told him it was fine. I told him that people laugh at things they don't understand, and that the laughter was evidence we had done it right, because if they had understood what we were doing, they would not have been laughing. The 8 weeks that followed were not easy. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is a temptation to describe this period as a comfortable wait, as though we simply sat back and watched events unfold. We did not. Those 8 weeks were an enormous amount of work. We maintained all our operational responsibilities. Every human peacekeeping unit, every logistics team, every medical responder continued doing their jobs in the regions where their contracts ran directly through Earth systems rather than the Council. Joint structure. We did not abandon the people who depended on us. What we withdrew was our participation in the joint framework, the Council's credit for our work, the shared command structure, the unified reporting chain. Our people stayed. The Council's claim on them left. We documented everything. Every communication from Council delegates seeking back-channel conversations was logged. The 3 private outreach attempts from senior-tier delegations were particularly carefully recorded. Henry was very specific about this, not because we planned to use them as leverage in a punitive sense, but because the record needed to be complete. History needed to know what had happened, and in what order. I received Drevanath's private communication on the 31st day. He had found a channel through a neutral third party, rather than going through official routes, which told me he wanted the conversation off the record. I read his message carefully. It was well written. It was the work of a skilled diplomat who wanted something without appearing to want it. He described his concern for the Accord's progress. He expressed his hope that a path forward could be found. He did not mention Article 12. He did not mention the Day 17 revision. He said he valued humanity's significant contribution to galactic stability. I wrote him back the same day. My reply was also carefully written. I thanked him for reaching out. I said we shared his commitment to the Accord's goals. I said that the United Earth Directorate was prepared to return to the table when the conditions were right. I listed the conditions. They were the same conditions I had sent through official channels. The 3 sentences that had been read to the full chamber. He replied the following day. He suggested that perhaps the Article 12 language was a matter that could be revisited in committee. I replied, the original language should be restored before the committee convenes, not by the committee. These are different processes with different outcomes, and the distinction matters to us. He did not reply for 4 days. When he did, his message was shorter. He said he was working to build consensus within the Council. I said I appreciated that, and that we would be ready to return when the consensus was reached. During this period, Laura kept me updated on the Frontier Zone data. I did not enjoy reading it. The deterioration in Zone 2 was exactly what our models had projected, and knowing your model was correct is not a satisfying feeling when real people are dealing with real consequences. The plague ship situation was the hardest to read about. Laura flagged it for me on the day the quarantine was extended. and I sat with it for a long time before responding. Oliver asked me once, during week 5, whether we were being too hard. He was sitting across from me in the Geneva Orbital Conference Room, and he had a datapad with the Zone 2 numbers on it, and he said it carefully, because he is a careful person, but he meant it as a real question. I told him I understood why he was asking. I told him I had asked myself the same question, probably every other day for the past 5 weeks. Then I told him the thing I had been working out for myself during those 5 weeks, which is this. If we accepted soft terms, a committee review, a vague commitment to revisit the language, a return to the table without clear restoration of what was taken, we would be back in the same position within a year, not necessarily with us but with someone. The council had a pattern. They had used the same procedural tools on at least 2 other junior designated species in the past decade. One of those species was now functionally marginalized, their proposals never reaching a vote. The other had left the council entirely. Neither outcome was acceptable to us, and more importantly, neither was acceptable for what the accord was supposed to mean. This was not just about us. It was about what kind of institution the Galactic Council was going to be. An institution that treated new members as lesser members until they had spent a century proving themselves, while quietly consuming their labor and their resources, was not an institution that would build lasting peace. It would build resentment. It would build exactly the kind of tension that produced the frontier conflicts we were all supposedly here to prevent. Hard terms now meant a stronger council later. I believed that. I still believe it. Oliver nodded slowly and wrote something in his notes. He did not ask the question again. On day 53, I received a formal communication through official channels. The council was prepared to restore the original Article 12 language in full. The formal apology, the phrase I had required, entered into the official record, had been agreed. The new co-sponsorship and floor procedure rules had been revised to eliminate the mechanisms that had been used to suppress debate. A new seat structure had been drafted that required a full 2/3 council vote to alter senior tier rights, rather than a procedural block vote during recess. I read the communication 3 times. Then I called Henry in and read it to him. He sat quietly through it. When I finished, he said the apology language. Read that part again. I read it again. It was clear, unambiguous, entered into the permanent record, not hidden in a supplementary document. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather's quote." I smiled. I had quoted it to him once early on during the planning of Option 12. I drafted our response. It was warm, professional, and expressed genuine commitment to the Accord's goals, because I did genuinely want the Accord to succeed. That had never been in question. The only question had been whether it would succeed in a form that treated every species at the table as a participant rather than as a resource. I attached one additional document to the response. I had prepared it over the previous 2 weeks, working with Henry and Laura to compile it. It was a complete accounting of every human operational contribution to the Accord framework that had never been entered into the official record. Every peacekeeping mission, every logistics operation, every medical deployment, every emergency response, all of it documented with dates, locations, outcomes, and attribution. 47 pages. I titled it A Gift of Transparency. I sent it without comment. The document spoke for itself. We packed for Vithara Station. 41 days after the emergency session that changed everything, the human delegation came back. I was standing near the entrance when they arrived, not by intention but by circumstance. I had been in a corridor meeting that ran long, and I was walking back to the main chamber when the transit doors at the end of the hall slid open. I stopped where I was. They came in the same way they had left, quietly. No ceremony, no dramatic entrance, no visible sense of triumph. Ambassador Sutton was at the front, moving at a steady pace, her people behind her in the same orderly formation I had watched walk out 8 weeks ago. She was wearing the same style of formal diplomatic attire she had worn throughout the original sessions. Her aide Oliver Grant was 2 steps behind her, datapad in hand, eyes on the corridor ahead. I had spent 8 weeks replaying the moment of the walkout in my mind, and I had imagined the return many times. And in almost every version I had imagined, there was some quality to it, some trace of satisfaction, or vindication, or even the particular quiet pride that beings feel after they have endured something difficult and come through it right. Some sign. There was none of that. Sutton walked past me without ceremony, nodded once in greeting the way you nod to a colleague in a hallway, and continued into the chamber. I followed. I want to tell you what the chamber felt like that morning, because I think it matters. The formal ceremony of the return was brief. The council's administrative clerk read a short statement confirming the procedural changes that had been agreed. Councillor Drevenath read the apology. The full text as required entered into the official record. It was the first formal apology issued by the Galactic Council to a member species in 300 years of recorded council history. I had looked this up the night before. 300 years. The last one had been issued over a border dispute that had taken 8 years to resolve. This one had taken 8 weeks. Drevenath read it with the controlled expression of a being performing an extremely difficult task with impeccable professionalism. He did not sound broken by it. He sounded like a skilled diplomat doing the right thing at a significant personal and institutional cost. And I found that I respected that. In the way you can respect someone's conduct even when you believe they made the error that made the conduct necessary. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Sutton said from her seat, "Thank you, counselor. We're glad to be back." And she opened her datapad, and the session began. I watched the room through that first morning session, and what I saw was different from every session I had observed in 7 months of negotiations before the walkout. The difference was not dramatic. It was not visible in any single gesture or statement. It was in the quality of the attention. The smaller delegations listened differently. The Barathi sat straighter. Kala Ren in particular, who had spoken those 2 words 11 months in the emergency session, sat with a focused alertness that had not been present in earlier weeks. The representatives from the Mirek systems, who had been largely quiet throughout, were now actively taking notes during every floor discussion. The delegation from the Veth Collective, who had arrived at the negotiations as junior observers and had barely spoken in 7 months, raised their hand during an open floor discussion and made a point. The floor monitor called on them within 2 speakers. Their point was acknowledged. These were small things, but they were not nothing. On the Talshriven side, the energy was different in a different way, not hostile. Sutton's return had been accepted as the outcome, and the senior block was moving forward, with professional composure, but subdued. The easy confidence that had characterized their sessions, the fluid procedural maneuvering, the small moments of what I can only describe as social comfort that powerful delegations display when they feel secure in their position. Those were quieter now, not absent, quieter. I found myself watching a specific Talshriven junior analyst, one who had made the comment that I had lip-read during the emergency session, the one I had translated as immovable. He sat with his notes in his lap and paid close attention to every development without any visible expression. Once, during a recess, I saw him reading something on his personal device with unusual concentration. From the angle, it looked like it might have been the document Sutton had attached to her acceptance communication. The 47-page accounting, the one she had titled, "A Gift of Transparency." The document had been entered into the Council's public record as a supplementary exhibit. It was available to everyone. I had read it in full the night before the session. I had sat with my tea and read it from the first page to the last, and by the end I had a feeling that I can only describe as the sensation of seeing a familiar room from a new angle. Not a different room, the same room, but suddenly understanding which walls were structural and which were decorative. The document was not accusatory. It was not triumphant. It was simply a list, with dates and numbers and outcomes, of work that had been done and never credited. Entry was dry and factual. The cumulative effect was extraordinary. Peacekeeping operation in Zone 2, North Station Cluster. Cycle 14 through 22, Human Rapid Deployment Unit, 340 personnel, 2 active de-escalations, 0 civilian casualties. Medical interventions totaling 4,012 cases. Supply deliveries totaling 1,200 metric loads of essential goods. Official Council record for the same period. Joint peacekeeping presence maintained. Entry after entry. 47 pages. The Council had spent 7 months in those negotiations treating the humans as newcomers who needed to earn their place at the table. The document did not argue against this. It simply showed in exhaustive and verifiable detail what those newcomers had been quietly doing, while the established species argued about their eligibility to speak. By the second day of resumed negotiations, I had heard from colleagues in 4 different delegations that the document was being read internally. By the third day, 3 delegations had requested bilateral meetings with human liaisons to discuss operational coordination frontier regions. These were not requests that would have come before, not because the operational need had not existed, but because no one had been thinking of the humans as the people to call for that kind of conversation. They were thinking about it now. Something else happened on the 4th day that I want to record, because I believe it was significant. During the late afternoon session, covering amendments to Article 7's arbitration procedures, a Talshriven representative, not a senior figure, one of the second-tier analysts, attempted to introduce a procedural motion that would have required all floor amendments to receive prior written notice of 48 hours before being discussed. This was, I recognized immediately, a version of the same procedural tools that had been used to suppress human proposals in the previous sessions. The 48-hour rule would have slowed debate considerably and, given the drafting block time to adjust their language in response to any challenge before it could be formally heard. The Talshriven representative presented it as an efficiency measure. There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds after he finished speaking. Then Kala Ren raised her hand and was acknowledged immediately. She said, very calmly, that the Barathi delegation did not support the amendment, as it would restrict the ability of delegations to respond to emerging issues in real time, which was particularly important, given the lessons of recent months regarding the need for flexibility in frontier zone management. The Mirak delegation seconded her objection before she had finished her sentence. Then the Veth Collective, then a small delegation from the Outer Rim systems I had not previously heard speak on procedural matters, then 4 more. The motion was voted down 11-2 within 6 minutes. The Talshriven representative accepted the outcome without visible reaction. He wrote something in his notes and moved on. I wrote something in my notes too. What I wrote was this: the humans had not organized that response. Sutton had not spoken during the exchange. Oliver Grant had not passed notes to neighboring delegations. The rejection of that procedural motion had come from a room full of species that had, over the past 8 weeks, done their own reading and their own calculating, and had arrived at their own conclusions. The walkout had not only brought the humans back to the table on better terms, it had changed what the other people at the table were paying attention to. That is the part I did not anticipate. I do not think the humans anticipated it either, though Sutton might have hoped for it. The effect was not just bilateral, between humanity and the Council's senior bloc. It was systemic. Every small delegation that had been quietly absorbing the same procedural marginalization over the years, every species that had learned to stay quiet because speaking up was procedurally expensive, had watched what happened and was now sitting differently. The floor was more contested now, more alive, more honest. On the 7th day of resumed negotiations, I found myself walking back from the evening meal alongside Henry Park, the human deputy who had been Sutton's closest collaborator throughout. We had spoken very little during the original sessions. I had been cautious about association, which I am not proud of, but the restored atmosphere made certain conversations feel more natural. I told him I had read the transparency document in full. He said he was glad, and asked if I had any questions about the methodology. I said the methodology was clear. I said I was more interested in the decision to produce it. I asked him when it had been started. He said, about 4 months before we left. Once we knew we were going to leave, we wanted to make sure the record was complete. I thought about that. You knew 4 months before. We suspected earlier than that, he said. The co-sponsorship rule was the first real signal. After that, we started preparing. I asked him whether it had been difficult, during those months, to continue doing the work at full capacity when they already knew they were planning to leave. He considered this for a moment. It would have been difficult to do it any other way, he said. The work mattered. The people in those zones were real. We were not going to do less because we were angry at the people getting credit for it. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing for a moment. Then I asked him whether it had been satisfying. When they came back and the apology was read, he shook his head slightly. Not satisfying, he said. More like, correct. Satisfying is what you feel when you win something. This was not about winning. It was about fixing something that was broken, and it got fixed, and now we have a lot of work to do. He paused. Satisfying would have been not needing to do any of this in the first place. I thought about that for the rest of the evening. On the last day of the negotiations, 31 days after the human delegation returned, the Vithara Accord was signed, all 34 species. The signing ceremony was recorded and transmitted to every inhabited system in the known galaxy. The ceremony lasted 2 hours and ended with something that had not been planned into the formal protocol: a sustained, collective acknowledgement from the chamber floor, not quite applause in any species' cultural form but its equivalent. A sustained layered sound that meant the same thing in 40 different emotional registers. Sutton accepted it without standing. She remained seated, nodded once to the room, and returned to her documents. I watched her do this and I thought about my first note, the one I had written on the night of the walkout 7 months ago. I am not certain this is the correct conclusion. I thought about how long it had taken the rest of us to catch up to the certainty she had already reached. That evening, I started writing the account you are reading now. I am writing it for my successor, whoever eventually inherits my seat at the Drenathi table, because I think the lesson of Vithara is the kind of lesson that does not transfer through official records. The official records will say that the accord was signed, that an apology was issued, that procedural reforms were implemented. All of that is true. None of it is the lesson. The lesson is harder to write down. I have been attempting it for several hours now and I keep arriving at the same place. For most of my career, I believe that experience was the primary currency of diplomatic power. The older you are, the longer your civilization has existed, the more history you carry, the more authority you hold. This belief was not stupid. It has a great deal of truth in it. Experience matters. History matters. There is real wisdom in longevity. But I had confused longevity with awareness. I had assumed that old civilizations, by virtue of their age, had stopped making a particular kind of error. The error of forgetting to look at what they take for granted. Humanity was young. They lived short lives, by our standards, and felt everything with an intensity that older species found exhausting and often naive. They arrived at the table with a fire that we had long since banked into careful embers. We mistook the fire for immaturity. We mistook their intensity for instability. We mistook their willingness to do unglamorous work without complaint for an inability to negotiate from strength. The most patient thing I ever watched was Claire Sutton sitting through 7 months of deliberate marginalization without showing a single crack, while her team quietly mapped every load-bearing wall in the architecture of peace and prepared, with methodical care, to demonstrate what those walls were holding. She did not wait because she was weak. She waited because she understood that premature force is less effective than perfectly timed precision. She waited because she knew that the argument was only as powerful as the moment in which it was made, and that the right moment required the right conditions, and that the conditions had to be built, not found. I have been a diplomat for a long time. I have seen many kinds of strength. I have seen the strength of armies and the strength of economies, and the strength of alliances built over centuries. I have seen the strength of ancient civilizations that have forgotten more about statecraft than most species will ever learn. What I saw at Vithara was different from all of those. What I saw was the strength of a species that had spent its entire history on a single world, making every mistake that a species can make and surviving them, and learning from them and building, from those hard lessons, a set of capabilities that no amount of galactic longevity can teach. The ability to know exactly how much you are worth, to prove it quietly, and to wait with perfect stillness for the moment when the proof becomes undeniable. They did not come back to Vethera as the victors of a contest. They came back as the authors of a correction. And in a galaxy full of ancient species who had spent centuries confusing age for wisdom, that was the more remarkable achievement. I have one more thing to say, and then I will end this account. On the last day of the Accord negotiations, after the signing ceremony, I found myself standing near the window of a side corridor with a view of the station's outer ring. Oliver Grant was standing nearby, looking at the same view. I had spoken to him a few times by then and found him to be exactly what his months of dignified endurance had suggested: careful, intelligent, and entirely without illusions. I asked him what his grandfather's quote was. I had heard, by then, that Sutton had one she was known for, but I was curious whether he had his own. He thought for a moment. Then he smiled and said, "My grandmother, actually. She used to say, the person in the room who doesn't need to speak the loudest already knows they're the most important one there. And if they haven't told you yet, it's because they're waiting to see if you'll figure it out yourself." He looked at the stars outside the window. "We waited a long time," he said, without any particular bitterness. "Longer than we should have had to." I did not disagree with him. I said, "We will not make you wait again." He nodded once. The same way Sutton had nodded when she walked back into that chamber. Brief, complete, requiring no elaboration. The stars turned outside the window, steady and enormous and indifferent to the small and consequential things that had just been done by small and consequential beings in a station floating among them. The Vithara Accord was signed. The peace, this time, was built on an honest foundation. It was, I believe, the first time we had managed that.